Hello, everyone, and welcome to our LeanAppSec session titled Why AppSec Priorities Shift. Those of you who are AppSec practitioners are probably very familiar with this problem of being able to get developers time and attention to fix security vulnerabilities rather than just having reports sit on a shelf. So we're gonna talk about that today. I'm Darren Meyer. I'm a staff research engineer with Endor Labs, and with me today I have a colleague, Jamie Scott, who is our lead product manager for certain areas of our product and has been a former security engineer before his product manager. So he's lived the life of trying to get people to fix things, both inside and outside of development, and both from a security seat and from a product management seat. And more importantly, we have here today an actual software developer with us. My other colleague, Camilla, has been a principal engineer with nearly 20 years of development experience and serves as a lead software architect here as well as principal engineer, and helps implement our product, has a lot of experience working closely with security teams across multiple verticals to make sure that software is secure. Welcome.
Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So I want to just dive right in a little bit. As an AppSec practitioner myself, I've been fighting with developers, both as a developer a little bit and as a software security person for almost as long as you've been a developer, Camilla. So it'll be interesting to get your kind of point of view on this. And it's always been a challenge to make sure that what's a priority to me and what's a priority to the rest of the organization are aligned, and getting other people to move and understand, but also knowing what I have to move on and what I have to let go. And I know that you've always had a really strong relationship with your AppSec teams. What did you do to kind of build that relationship?
Wow, that's a big question. I think there's a couple of things that you have to look at in terms of what developers are what's going on for developers, right? There's two things. So one is, what do they actually want to do? And two, how are they measured? Like, what are they judged on? Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, security doesn't enter into either of those things. The one thing that developers want to work on is usually the latest and greatest, sexiest new feature. You'd be surprised how hard it is to even get developers to write proper repeatable unit tests or integration tests for their own features, because they're so focused on just writing the feature. And then what they're measured on is typically, was the feature delivered on time? And hopefully they're also measured on the quality of the feature, which is typically defined by how many bugs QA finds. And unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, that might not even touch on security. QA is looking for crashes. They're looking for, is it working as advertised? Hopefully some of the corner cases. But in many organizations, we don't have a specifically security built into that. So where I have seen it work very well, to answer your question, Darren, is when this comes from the top down and you build it in to what, especially, I mean, you can't change what developers really want to work on, but you can educate them. More security training leads to more awareness, and hopefully that will cause them to be more interested in it. But if you build it in, for example, to QA, if you have a specific track in the QA testing that they will get measured on, is if somebody can break in and hack into the system, they're going to be forced to work on it.
Sure.
Does that answer your
So
question?
it does, and I think it highlights something that I heard a lot, which is something I think is a myth, but I'd love to hear your take on it, which is you'll often hear people in AppSec say, well, developers just don't care about security at all. And it sounds like that's not really the case. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Well, again, I don't think it's not that they don't care. You'd be surprised. I think you'd be shocked at how few developers, I can't speak for everybody, but in my experience, there are more developers than not that don't know what a CVE is. And so this is not something that is part of anything that they think about day to day. It's not that they don't care, it's just that it doesn't really enter into their world or their bubble that they're in. Whereas every single developer who has ever lived has had their code crash at some point. So when they get a bug about a crash, that's something very, very important to them, and that's something that's very tangible and easy for them to care about and understand. Whereas some possible security thing in some library that they're not even sure is used is not going to be, it's not going to be interesting to them. It's not that they don't care, but they've got a lot of other things that are way more fun and interesting and flashy.
And that they're being measured on, it sounds like, right?
Well, exactly. And so if they were measured on how many security bugs that they fixed or introduced, that would probably change what they cared about. But I don't think it's not that they don't care. Like, most developers definitely care. If you were to go to them and one-to-one explain that there is a very real chance that a hacker could break your code here, they would absolutely care. It's just that there are so many middlemen that are, or women, between where the security bug is raised and the actual developer that's going to fix it, that it gets completely lost in translation why they're doing this.
Yeah, I want to dig into that a little bit, because a lot of times, like, AppSec teams are communicating with developers through like one of two things, right? It's usually there's a report that gets delivered to somebody, say, a giant PDF or a giant CSV file of here's all the stuff that's wrong, go prioritize it. Or it's like opening Jira tickets or some equivalent like that. And I think we all get the sense that that's not very effective. And you touched on a little bit in the last thing you said about, like, there's so many middlemen. Could you talk a little bit about, like, what actually happens when I open a Jira ticket for my dev team?
Well, that's going to be so different depending on your organization and your company and your culture. But let's say we have a middle-sized organization where you have a dedicated security team. First of all, security bugs are different because they typically affect, well, very often they affect the entire software system. So you immediately, at the first point of, it needs to be triaged and it needs to be assigned to a team. But if it has to do with, for example, you need to upgrade a version of a library, say you have, I mean, this is, again, different depending on your software architecture, but let's say you have a monorepo. Upgrading a library will affect the entire software system, so it will affect every single team. So now you need somebody to coordinate the effort of testing every single component that is going to be impacted by this upgrade, which is all of them. And so that means you have a lot of team leads that need to be involved to coordinate this. And you need testing resources and to find time for all of these people that have, then you typically have a product, you have some sort of a scrum manager, somebody who's in charge of scheduling the work. And a lot of times in good organizations, work is scheduled pretty far out. And so a massive coordination effort like this will require a lot of different hands and eyeballs and a lot of meetings.
Right. And I think that's maybe surprising to a number of AppSec people is, a lot of my peers I've talked to, and they have this idea that, well, developers aren't prioritizing stuff, but it sounds like in a lot of organizations, developers aren't the ones doing the prioritizing to begin with. It's somebody else,
Correct.
like a scrum master or a product manager. And, like, can you talk a little bit about the kind of relationship that developers have with, like, product from a developer's standpoint?
With product specifically, how do you mean?
Well, like, so product managers are giving you, kind of at a high level, are giving you your priorities, and, like, in the details, you've got a scrum master that's maybe making the detailed decisions about how to achieve those, what stories to implement and those kinds of things. And, like, the product manager that you work with is probably not a developer, probably not on the development team. So how do you work with that person?
Well, again, depending on your organization, there's probably going to be there's going to be hops in between the product manager. I mean, I know line managers hate it when product managers go directly to their developers. That's a big no-no, and that causes a lot of friction. And so in most organizations, the developers get information via their direct line manager or scrum master, whatever your organization calls it. So there's already a gate in between the product manager and the developer. If they go directly to the developer, that causes a lot of political problems typically, and that can cause a lot of friction. And then now all of a sudden the manager is a lot less likely to want to work with you next time.
Right. It's a long-term negotiation, right? Not just a one-time shot. I wanted to ask a little bit of question before I kind of get Jamie's perspective on the same thing, since he's on the other side of that divide. I wanted to ask you a little bit about kind of what happens when security work does actually land on your plate. I know that there's a lot of debate on AppSec teams that are trying to be effective about what information and what context actually helps developers get a security fix done. Can you talk a little bit about what helps you?
Well, I think the number one thing is to show that it's actually applicable. I think there's a lot of noise that you have a lot of, they give you a lot of these, that it turns out that you're not even on the version that has the problem. And even if you are, you're only using one function from this library, and the problem is in a completely different part of the library, and you know that code will never get executed, and therefore you're not vulnerable. And so I think there's a bit of fatigue that happens. The more of these that you get, you only have so much time in the day, and you're spending all this time that feels like wasted time, because every time you get to the end of it and you realize that this doesn't apply to me and it's not worth doing the upgrade, because like I said earlier, doing an upgrade can sometimes be extremely time confusing and just involves a lot of bureaucracy just to get it done. Even at the end of the day, it's a safe upgrade. You don't know that until you've gotten everybody involved and performed all the extra testing required. So I think the number one thing is, if you can show that the code is reachable, or at least that you know what version they're on, and that specific version has a problem, and that you can highlight why it has a high EPSS score or why it has a high CVSS score. I think those things will get the developer's attention in a way that just saying, oh, here's a list of 10,000 security bugs.
Right. So kind of like a combination of like specificity, right? Of being able to clearly articulate what the problem is, where it is, that kind of thing. The more of that they can do for you, the better. Would you agree with that part?
Yeah, well, going back to like my example of like if the source code is crashing, that is something that's very interesting to the developer, because I mean, first of all, it's very big and dramatic and noticeable, but it also has a very clear stack trace, so they can see it crashed on this line, in this function, in this file, and now I have something to go look at. That's much more attention grabbing than there's this like, oh, this just obscure security threat that maybe go look at it.
Yeah. So, you know, kind of proof of life, as it were, like being able to know that this really is a big deal, this really does affect me, and where it affects me is much more useful to you. Because is that largely just because it's more interesting, or is it because it saves you time, or a little both?
I mean, I think that'll vary, but I think it comes down to the developers are busy, and they'll fix the things like, for example, crashes will come to the top of the list. And if you have enough of those, you might not have time to do security fixes unless it comes top down, like that you have to prioritize them.
Right. So compliance, or CEO says, or something along those lines.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing your perspective, Camilla. And I want to get Jamie's as well. And do feel free, by the way, to interrupt if Jamie says something that you want to comment on or object to or disagree with. I'm sure that would be useful and interesting. So, Jamie, you were a security engineer for a long time, trying to get all kinds of different people, not just developers, to fix issues. And now you've become a product manager, and your whole thing is getting developers to do stuff, right? So can you talk to me a little bit about the things that you do to try to make sure that security work gets prioritized appropriately with all the other things that you have to worry about?
Yeah, and I think net of it is security work is on the top of my mind because I live in the security space. But the reality is that day to day, I don't think about a security vulnerability, and this isn't what I'm incentivized to look at. So when I wake up in the morning, I think about net new deals. I think about where I can add value to customers and what their biggest problems are. And a security vulnerability is never on that list. So I think the reality is, well, I try and secure vulnerabilities. And if something is meaningful to me, like if someone shows me I'm dumping half of the data from your database, that's something that's meaningful and tangential, that's an existential issue I'm going to prioritize. But at the end of the day, if there's a known vulnerability, I prioritize it because there's a program that I have to. It's not necessarily because it's what I think about either. So like net, it's not top of mind because I'm not incentivized to.
Right. And you say, you know, when unless somebody kind of brings it to you and makes it a priority for you, where does that usually come from?
From my perspective, it comes from our customers. But at the end of the day, if a customer comes to me and says, hey, there's a vulnerability, sure, I'm going to prioritize that. The reality is that customers aren't actively testing in a lot of scenarios, especially in vendor code.
Mm-hmm.
And if I were to put my shoes in, say, a product league at a healthcare organization, like I doubt my customers are going to come to me and say, hey, there's a security vulnerability. So like most of that is sourced from an internal security team in the vast majority of organizations. And it's coming to you either because you've proactively tested. So for example, we have regular penetration tests. And those things are top of mind to me because I have a customer commitment that I will perform a regular penetration test. Mm-hmm. But outside of that regular penetration test that I'm performing, it's not something that's regularly top of mind unless it's directly in front of me. And sometimes that's an approval gate. Sometimes that is a penetration test. But in terms of a penetration test, I see what that means to my organization. Mm-hmm. That's something that my customers care about. I'm going to slow sales cycles if I don't have that. In terms of an approval gate, sure, I care about that, but that's because I'm trying to get past that as quickly as possible so that I can deliver customer value. So my incentives are completely mismatched from what I would generally expect as a security engineer.
Right. And then when you talked about like customer drivers and you talk about slowing the sales cycle, I kind of perked up a little bit. I'm guessing that's where like compliance oriented things come into play because we don't do compliance, you know, in software companies or anybody who has a software product. We don't do it for giggles, right? We do it because it helps us sell our product or our service. And so like, would you kind of think of it that way? Like things that like, if you had to be FedRAMP compliant, for example, would you see that kind of in the same light as a customer driver?
Yeah, absolutely. And if I had to be FedRAMP compliant, that would be directly in my path to actually delivering revenue.
Right.
But I kind of view it differently in terms of most contract obligations are going to have line items that say you perform this level of due diligence. And if I can't, then one of two things happens. Either I have to go implement that program, I already have that program, or I need to strike that from the contract in some meaningful way. And I think the reality is that contract obligations are where my primary incentives flow through as a product manager. Otherwise, I'm not incentivized, but I care about security. But that's simply because I'm a more security literate product manager than the vast majority of the world because I was a security engineer.
Right. So you had mentioned kind of related to that you had mentioned a little bit of like if somebody finds essentially a bug, right? You have a customer going, hey, we found a vulnerability in your product. You're going to prioritize that highly. And that made me think back to something that Camilla had said, which is that there's value in having QA do certain kinds of security testing for the developers because then it's just a bug that we proved gone wrong. And from a product management standpoint, would you consider bug fixes found by QA to be something that you are concerned with prioritizing, or do you pass those off to somebody?
Generally, I pass those off to somebody. That being said, like some are very visible to me. if a customer is facing a bug immediately in front of them, that's visible to me. If that's a bug that QA found, I might not be looking at it at all.
Sure. Well, I really appreciate the context you gave there, and I wanted to kind of pick both of your brains on something, if I could, which is a theme that you both hit on a little bit, was this idea that there are concrete things. Customer found a bug, there's a crash, and then a lot of security stuff seems very hypothetical. I know that developers and project managers alike, and product managers alike, do concern themselves a little bit with hypothetical risk. And I'm familiar with, on the development side, like the concept of tech debt, for example. How do you go about, in your respective roles, kind of negotiating with one another to do something that's not like immediately on fire, that's kind of a hypothetical risk in general? And as a follow-up to that, like, does that apply to security risk at all?
Yeah, I think absolutely it does. And I think the next best thing to having security focus come from the top, like when I say, I mean, in great organizations have a focus on security that they're measured by, and there's education and there's all these processes and policies in place. If you don't have that, the next best thing that you can have is finding a champion who really cares about this and who makes it their purpose to deal with this and make sure that we don't have any fires, like or try to minimize the number of fires that break out. And then you need at least one person who's really passionate about that. You as a security team, you need to find that liaison on the developer side, somebody who can be your champion and help you understand how the development organization works in your specific company, and try to see what works for your company. I think they're all going to be so different.
Sure.
I just want to double click on that and tell a personal story. So our champion for security within Endor Labs is Dimitri, one of our co-founders. And he is very security literate, very technical, and has a lot of influence. But at the end of the day, I found myself in our very early days at Endor Labs saying, hey, this is a reasonable trade-off. I don't think that this is going to harm security of our product. And I was coming at that from a security engineer's point of view. He was arguing that we should always have the most secure approach. And I think having that champion to always be front and center and say, but the important thing is having a champion with influence. Because if that's a champion who doesn't have influence, then that conversation looks incredibly different. And I found myself actually arguing for something that might be more usable, that's marginally less secure, and having to fight that with that champion on a regular basis. And that's something that I thought was the greatest security dynamic that ever existed. In retrospect, having like the CISP product manager arguing for something less secure is the best place you can be in.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, that must have been uncomfortable for you for a minute.
It was.
Well, no, but I think what you said is so true for developers too, that sense of negotiating, that like they'll pick something less secure, not because they don't care about security, but they do feel that the trade-off is worth it. Like Jamie said, they feel like they have a really good technical reason for choosing the alternative. And so you have to be in those conversations. You have to, and that's why I keep saying about building it into all of your RFCs, and your development process needs to have a stage where you check in on security risks and you have these conversations. And I think developers are very open to having their minds changed if you can show them why something is less secure. Like I'm sure Dimitri must have convinced you to go his way eventually, right?
A lot of the time.
Well, yeah, because he could demonstrate why. Mm-hmm. But the important thing is having those conversations.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it goes both ways too. And so, like, I'll give an example of a debate that I've heard, and I'd love your take on it, Camilla, which is, a lot of times as security people, if we're fixing like dependency vulnerabilities, for example, our solution is patch it, upgrade it, always upgrade, always upgrade. And I've seen developers push back and be like, okay, I could, upgrade it, or I could downgrade, and that's actually easier for us. Have you ever had a conversation like that? Is that something that you want to be able to talk to security about, those kinds of things?
Absolutely. I think there's actually been a lot of research showing and papers written showing that developers will more often than not do a downgrade rather than an upgrade, because a downgrade is considered way less risky. And so I think that should always be an option. I think that's a very valid concern.
So it kind of sounds like, one of the things that you need from security teams is for them to give you options and choices rather than just say do X and be very like prescriptive about it. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
Cool.
I think one more thing I wanted to say about that is that developers they don't love being told what to do by somebody who doesn't know the code, right? That is something that I think is probably true across the board. But also a lot of developers tend to be very reluctant to touch other people's code. And so when we're talking about upgrades, I mentioned this earlier, that often can affect the entire system, that is not something that they enter into lightly or willingly. And so they will put that off as long as they can. So if you have an alternative that isn't going to impact the entire system, they're going to be much more likely to do it.
That makes a lot of sense. And actually, I think that's a really nice segue into something else I wanted to kind of pick your brain on, which is we've talked a lot about getting the work prioritized and kind of what helps do that. But at a certain point, once it's prioritized and you've decided you're going to take up a certain path, you want to get done as quickly as possible. Because like, as you said, Camilla, like you've got more important stuff to work on. Jamie wants people to deliver features. So how do you go about like what helps you execute quickly once you have decided like, yes, I'm going to patch this vulnerability or I'm going to fix my code over here? What helps you go fast?
You mean from security, like from what they could give me?
Like what could I give you? Yeah.
I think, like I said before, that knowing that this vulnerability is actually applicable to my code is probably the most important information, if you can give me that.
I'm asking in part because there's this thing that's always kind of like I've always suspected was a little bit BS that a lot of vendors like to do, which is like, hey, we want to shift left as far as possible, so we should give all of our security tools should be available as an IDE plugin.
Oh, no. I would not.
Tell me about that.
No, I don't. I think IDE plugins are, I mean, again, I can't speak for everybody, but the fewer IDE plugins I need, the better, because they never really work as advertised, and they slow down my system. They're always bugging me about upgrades or talking to me, and I find them annoying. And like I said, like I don't think that they ever function as advertised. There's some exceptions, obviously, but in general, I don't think that that's a good idea.
Right. So, like, what if you were to adopt a security kind of a tool that's built with security in mind? Like, what kinds of things would actually be helpful to you on like the desktop side, on the work side?
I think that's going to depend on your development environment and the ecosystem and that you're programming in, and your company's policies. I know we're talking about shifting left as far as possible, but having a lot of things integrated into your CI pipeline, I find work quite well, because that's a place where you have a long list of things boxes that need to be checked for the commit to go through. And so you're already sort of in the mindset of, okay, what is my compliance? Like, did all the IT tests run, or did sanity fail, or did my whatever static analysis find anything at that point, I'm already open to looking at other tools and clicking on links and investing time, I should say, in these kind of things. When I'm in my zone programming, I really would like to reduce the noise, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally does. It's I feel the same way about the things that I produce, right? I don't want helpers and bugging and like, let me do the work and then tell me if I need anything fixed after. It seems to be a common thing that I hear from not just dev, but kind of everybody who does like intense creative or engineering type work. What about you, Jamie? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, so I was just gonna say, one thing that I've done that works really well for me in the past when I've had something that I need to enforce for my developers, and I can't really convince them to just do it, is I'll build something into the build time environment. So it'll cause the build to fail if they use a library that they're not supposed to use. Or say we've replaced, like, say we have instead of using the standard Go JSON library, we have our own in-house version. The build will flag that and say, hey, you're using this version of JSON, but we have our company policy is that we want to use that version. And then they can't finish the build unless they change it, or other things. But that one's been effective for me. I don't know how much other developers love that idea, but that's worked really well for me at that stage, because you're not interrupting them as they're coding, but you are still catching it very early on.
Sure. And I suppose there's a degree of, feeling like it probably lands different when you, as a principal engineer with all this experience, are saying this is the right way to do something, and I've expressed it as a code policy or a build policy, versus me coming from outside dev and going, hey, I need you to do this way. I feel like developers would be more resistant to it coming from outside their own. Or do you think that's fair?
Sometimes, but I think building these relationships and the political capital there is still important. And if you have that champion, and you work all these different gates between you and the developers, I think that there can be some trust there at that level. I think that developers want to trust you as a security team, that you know what's right, as long as you defer to them when it comes to the technical aspects of what the software actually does.
Mm-hmm. Do you find it helpful when there's at least somebody on the security team who kind of speaks developer?
Absolutely. I'm sure it's the same way the other way around.
100%. I'm curious as to kind of your take on this, Jamie, how you see product kind of plugged into that, because a lot of what Camilla and I have been discussing in the past few minutes has been about like direct relationships between security and developers. But what about relationships between you and developer and security? How does that change or complicate things?
So I think the hardest part is I have a group or a team that I'm working with on the regular. And the problem to get me to prioritize something is I need to see tangible impact, because I'm hyper-focused on impact. And if you tell me, hey, here's a high-risk vulnerability, then I'm going to ask if it's exploitable first. If you give me a SAST finding, and I'll give you an example. I saw a SAST finding fairly recently that said, "Oh, you don't have a specific security header." And I looked at that for about 30 seconds and said, "Our content security policy already mitigates this. Why do I care?" Now, most product managers aren't going to actually do this, but I think at the end of the day, showing tangible impact gets me to prioritize something. And if you don't show me tangible impact, then it becomes a compliance conversation to me. And I guess the problem from my perspective is I want to deliver business value quickly, and I want to solve customer problems. And while tech debt is important to me, I view tech debt as like performance as a feature. getting something out the door faster is a feature to me. So like those things make sense to me to make investments. But otherwise, I don't want to bring up something intangible to Camilla on a Tuesday and waste her time when I really want her doing other things.
Right. Well, I mean, it's the other way around too. Like tech debt, it's funny hearing James say that, because I think on the engineering side, when we talk about, we know certain tech debt we have, it's always like, how can we spend time fixing this tech debt without product management realizing that that's what we're doing? Right? We're like, how can we package this so that we can also fix this tech debt? So it's very rare that you have like, okay, we're going to allocate all this time to just go fix this tech debt. It's always, we're like, okay, let's see what we can shove it in somewhere, and then product management won't notice.
Camilla, let me ask you a question, because I've heard this a lot fairly recently, and I want your take on it. A lot of what I've heard in the recent past is that security risk is a quality issue, and that it should be part of a developer's craft. So like there shouldn't have to be layers of people prioritizing this. It should just be commonly accepted. What do you think about that?
I love that. I think absolutely. And I think in well-functioning organizations, I think this is how it works. Unfortunately, security was, security, it's probably different in different generations of programmers too, but like security has always been, up until very recently, security has always been an afterthought. Like back when I was in school doing this kind of stuff, I don't remember that we even touched on security as a concern. That was just something that like it wasn't ever really thought of as an actual threat or actually something that you had to worry about. And I think that continues to this day, that it's not something, very, very few people have actually had their code hacked. Right? I think that it's always something that happens to somebody else, and so therefore it's not something that that we care about. But if we can change that mentality, which I think you do through education, then that would be ideal. That would be the perfect world where developers were thinking about this on their own. But you have to, as a company, you have to invest in a lot of training and resources for this to happen.
Yeah, you mentioned that kind of like it always seems to happen to somebody else. And I remember having a conversation with some colleagues about how what doesn't help us on the AppSec side make our case is that the stuff that hits the news is usually that when somebody does something really, really egregiously stupid, and that's why they got hacked. And so I think a lot of developers and even operations people, like it extends beyond development, go, well, we're competent and we don't do nonsense, silly nonsense like that, so we're fine. And all this other stuff that security tells us seems like very unlikely or very edge case or just like paranoia. Do you have a response? Like, A, does that resonate? And B, like, do you have a message for your peers, both of you, of maybe how to think better about security? Or
I'll let Jamie go first.
I'll tell you how I think about security. If something is tangible, you can show me a direct exploit, I care a lot immediately. But that being said, otherwise, it becomes a compliance tax to me. And what does everyone want to do with their taxes? They hire an accountant to reduce it. Everyone wants to reduce their taxes. No one wants to increase their taxes. So at the end of the day, the question becomes, how do security teams as a whole marginally or materially begin to reduce their taxes over time through program level changes? That's how I view security. But that being said, as a product manager, if someone showed me something tangible right now or showed me evidence to say I should care about this, cool. That's how to get me to start jumping through hoops. Camilla?
Well, I seem to remember that when I first got really interested in caring about security was when I took my first real security course at a company that I worked on, and it was mandatory. All developers had to take this course. And in that, they they went over some techniques and taught us how to actually break systems. And that was something that at the time I didn't have any experience with. And A, it was fun. But B, it really opened my eyes to how easy it was and how important it was to secure my code and to write that into my design as I was at the very beginning, as I'm starting to think about the system and the architecture. And just learning how to do that really just opened my eyes. Like I said, it's not that developers don't care. It's just that it's not something that is necessarily on their radar. And so the best possible way I think is education and showing them how it actually works and making it fun even.
I'm guessing by education you don't mean click through a PowerPoint presentation and take a test at the end either.
No, I think that's what I mean. Like the one I'm talking about, it was extremely interactive, and we got to do the hacking ourselves. It's pretty basic stuff, but it was still enough that it was very engaging and fun, and it opened my eyes to a world that I previously had no experience in, because it had just never been on my radar. It had never been something that I really had spent any time thinking about.
I really appreciate the insight that both you, Camilla, and you, Jamie, brought to this conversation. I kind of want to just kind of summarize the things I've heard, and you tell me if I'm on the right track. It sounds like the biggest key things that AppSec and Dev can do to help each other out are to just be educated about the other side of the fence, right? Developers being able to have access to stuff that they can learn a little bit about security, understand why it matters, understand how easy some of these attacks are, and security, like turning around and learning a little bit about the development world, understanding how code works, understanding how something goes from idea to feature, what it takes to actually do an upgrade. It's not easy. Those kinds of things, kind of build that mutual empathy, and then apply that to having program changes that really help an organization understand how security priorities fit in with all the other stuff that they have to worry about in terms of selling product and delivering features and fixing crashes and other kinds of bugs. Is it, I think, a reasonable summary of what you two have said?
Yeah.
All right. Anything, any other parting remarks you'd like to leave our audience with today?
I'll leave one. I think the single largest problem in application security at the moment is misaligned incentives. So I'll put it this way. Camilla said earlier, I'm passively aware. I know that this is important, but it's not top of my mind day to day. I think that's a fair summary of what you said, Camilla. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And to me, it's also something I care about, but it's also not something I'm incentivized to think about. I'm incentivized to think about customers. So unless we solve this incentive problem in some meaningful way, I think that's the number one problem. And I don't know how to solve that the right way. Like, I've seen some successful things, and I'm sure you can add, Darren.
Yeah, I was just going to say, like, I think the opposite's probably true too, having sat on the AppSec seat for so long, is that I find that a lot of AppSec people, those of us that came from software development a little differently, but a lot of us didn't. And like, our incentives are aligned to only really focus on the security stuff. And I think we need to do better too on the AppSec side of going, we are also incentivized to make the company successful. And like, we should be wanting to help development ship features and doing those things and not just get in their way, right? And have more of that common cause and empathy on our end too.
For me, I think I've just never understood the model of having an AppSec team that is separate from the rest of the development organization. That has never made any sense to me, because we're already designing in that it's a separate part, that it's apart from the rest. Like, I don't have the answer, but to me, it would make much more sense if that team was part of the organization. And I don't know if you have one person per development team or however you want to do it, but designing it that way, you've already kind of built in this barrier. And also perhaps, I think something that, I think I said this earlier, but I wonder if it's clear to AppSec is just how many gates there are between the AppSec team and the actual developer who's going to fix your problem. You have to get through all of these. And so when however it is that you communicate, it might not be enough to try to tailor it to just what's going to help the developer fix the problem. You have to worry about who's in between you and the developer and how do you convince them to prioritize this. And that might be a completely different set of data than what the developer is going to need. And so you have to kind of build that into your system as well, as how do you provide all of that without overwhelming each person at each stage of this chain.
It sounds like if you're not careful, Camilla, your next job might be VP of security.
You're funny.
I think those are great things, and I really appreciate the viewpoints. I do want to be mindful of your time and that of our audience today. So I want to thank you both for taking time out of your day to join me and provide this unique perspective. And I want to say just have a great day, and thanks for joining LeanAppSec.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers.
Okay, that was awesome. Hey, Jamie. Hey, Darren. Darren, I know you're joining us from the road. Which show are you at? Are you at LASCON?
I am at Sauce Fusion in Atlanta.
Okay. So I want to pick up on one specific thing that you had talked about, which is, and there's also a bunch of conversation about this in the chat, which is how do you actually communicate the information about vulnerabilities or about risks in general to developers? Camilla, I think, made a comment about IDE plugins not being the right way to do it. And Darren, you had mentioned that there are certain things that you want to see in kind of PR comments, pre-commit hooks, but there are some things you'd like to see in CI. What's the right balance there? Like specifically if we're talking about application security and like, let's take, for example, SCA alerts. I have a vulnerability in an open source package. Where is the right place, do you think, either as Jamie, as a vulnerability manager, like where would you surface that to developers ideally, like in a perfect world for you?
I would say anything that's quick and dirty, I would want as a pre-commit hook. Anything that requires some reasonably deep level of analysis, I would want in CI. So think of it this way. If I wanted to check for all secrets that potentially exist, I would want that as a pre-commit hook check. If I want to validate secrets against APIs and see what their permissions are to see if it's a material risk, I want that in CI.
Mm-hmm. And Camilla, from your perspective, as the person who Jamie goes to and says like, hey, please fix this, do you align with that or do you see it differently?
Well, I think secrets is an interesting example because secrets, I think, would be best to catch before they make it to the PR stage. Aside from that, I think I agree with that.
Darren, sorry, I cut you off.
Yeah, no, I was going to say that. Like, I agree with Jamie as a general rule, and I would just add that one piece to it is there are a few things that you really have to catch before they're checked in because there's so much work to correct. And secrets was a good example of that. Like once it's in Git, it's in the commit history, and once in the commit history, it's been leaked. So something that when I'm in I'm a hobbyist developer, but like when I'm in developer mode, I like to have things that I'm about to make a bigger mistake caught before I commit. So those things are useful to me. But anything else I want to have on the big hardware that can run while I'm getting a cup of coffee.
Do you ever risk having once you do that, do you ever risk catching something that is a tangible risk, like for example a reachable vulnerability, but you catch it a little bit too late and then it gets thrown into a backlog and only gets fixed months later, and you sort of have to live with it? Is there a trade-off that you can do to say I want to catch that earlier, even if that costs me some of Camilla not being happy with me because I got in the way of her shipping something?
I mean, for me, like the only thing that I care about is did it go to production? Because I don't want to get in the way of software dev, right? So software dev makes money. Everywhere I've ever worked in security, I've had stock. I want the stock to go up, right? Like everybody else. So I want to make sure that I don't get in the way of dev productivity unless I have a really, really good reason. And so to me, it's like, hey, let the CI do its job. It's there to catch problems that we don't want to escape to production. The only time that I'd want to make sure we got out before it got into CI would be if getting committed in the first place is going to be a source of risk, which is pretty much just secrets.
Also, I don't want to piss Camilla off, not because Camilla is terrifyingly scary, but because if I have a local control, then she's just going to turn it off if it pisses her off.
Yeah. One of our CEO's Varun's origin stories for this company was when he was running a 400-person engineering team at a much larger company. It devolved into basically everybody just using Slack, right? Like, hey, I need to update this dependency. Is anybody using it? And once they had like controls that are baked in, people just ended up turning them off because of noise. A lot of your conversation ended up being about the trust between an engineering team and an application security team. And that was also kind of a core concept of Dustin's talk that was this morning about security champions. And there's a lot of questions in the chat that I saw about like, okay, but how do I do that? And it seems so impossible, right? So, I mean, what I took away from it is, and I think Jamie, like maybe you can comment on this. When you were running vulnerability management programs, right? Both Jamie, both you and Darren, both of you are very knowledgeable about software development and can earn maybe a little bit more trust with your engineering counterparts. With the lack of like a very well structured, Dustin style security champions program, is that really the only way to get to that level of trust, just to make sure everyone on an application security team is somewhat of a hobbyist developer themselves? Because most of the question, at least that I see about that. What do you think?
I would love to have my AppSec team be all developers. When I've hired AppSec teams in the past, that's what I looked for. It's surprisingly hard to find people with a development background and a security background who want to do the security side. So it's challenging to scale to any reasonably sized team to do anything. And I think that's like Dustin's point about the security champions program is you can't really do AppSec at scale unless you have developers who have bought into security's importance enough to act as a champion within their teams. It doesn't necessarily have to be a formal program. Mm-hmm. If you get to know people and you inspire trust and you run an AppSec program so that you're on the development team's side rather than being in opposition to them, you can get things done. But at some scale point, you are going to need some degree of formality around that, because the time to do security work will get eroded if you don't have organizational buy-in that a formal program brings you.
Yeah. So now, Jamie, that you've transferred, you sold out and went into product management, and you define yourself as a recovering security practitioner. When you design products, do you find yourself translating those security requirements as part of the product requirements themselves, or not so much? Like, does it give you a different perspective as a product manager?
It only gives me a different perspective when thinking about platform level capabilities that require security. So like I had a different perspective when thinking about like authentication and authorization. I did not, and I had a different perspective when getting a pen test, because I mean, for all intents and purposes, I'm triaging it as kind of a first level triage. But at the end of the day, there's not really something that makes me think about differently with security. It's just accepting it more and pushing less when people say, hey, this will take some more time to do security. I think a lot of those, but it also allows me to push back when some of those are unreasonable trade-offs. So like, I tend to look at it from the perspective of trade-offs and not from the perspective of it's changed my mindset.
Yeah. And one last thing, just because it was a hot topic throughout the whole day. Camilla, you and Darren talked a little bit about training, and there were a bunch of comments in the chat about, it's not that developers don't care about security. It's like maybe they don't know what a CVSS score is, or what the difference between CVSS and EPSS and KEV and all those things. In companies you've worked at, because I know you worked at companies big and small, have you found like an effective way to do security training for developers, or does it always just come down to I think it's cool. I am volunteering. I'm going to go be a champion.
Well, I think I talked a little bit about that in the session, but for me, there was one company I worked at that had an extensive developer security training that was mandatory for all developers, and it was quite extensive. Like, it was like 50 modules. It was very interactive, and I think that investment made a huge difference because it forced developers to learn these things. For example, like you said, what an EPSS score is, what a CVSS score, and those were maybe not the most exciting modules, but they did make it. It was a really nice course, and I think the person who developed that for that company actually went on and started their own company just doing that. That's how successful that course was. So that was, in my experience, that's the best I've seen, and that really made a big difference because it really brought it to like top of mind for developers, and I think a lot of people learned things that they didn't know before.
Yeah, it's interesting getting the perspective of, hey, it's actually all about compliance. It's all about the trust between these teams. It's all about our process, and then kind of getting to the tools last. And our next session is actually about that bottom line, about why is no one fixing your vulnerabilities. We brought practitioners from a couple of our customers, from Jellyfish and from Starburst, that are going to be talking about this. Jamie, Darren, and Camilla, thank you so much for that session. I hope that you'll have time to hang out with us in the chat. I want to announce our first of 2 Millennium Falcon winners just before you sign off. We're going to be giving away 2. We're going to give away now one right now, and another one at the end of Alex's and James's talk. So our first winner is Tim Deerking. Tim, if you're in the chat, say something, and we will be sending you a Millennium Falcon. And also, if you can send us a picture of you putting it together or just receiving it. We have done this in the past. It's a lot of fun just to know that someone got the joy of building the Millennium Falcon. It's such a great kit. It's a massive kit. It's so great.